My name is Barbara. I am 60 years old, and what I'm about to tell you today will completely change the way you look at your own family. Just 3 days ago, my youngest son, Daniel, together with his wife, Olivia, pushed me and my husband, Thomas, off a cliff more than 30 meters high in Big Sur, California. As my body smashed against the rocks, my chest burning with pain, ribs cracking, blood pouring everywhere, I heard Thomas whisper desperately, "Barbara, don't move. Pretend to be dead." But the worst part wasn't the fall. The worst part was the horrifying truth Thomas confessed to me at that very moment. A secret he had hidden for 25 years, a truth connected to the very children we had once trusted, once loved with all our hearts. As I lay waiting to die at the bottom of the cliff, I heard Daniel whisper to Olivia, "They're dead." Eyes still open, but no breath left. "Perfect," Olivia replied, her voice chilling, as if victory was already hers. Everything went according to plan. Daniel laughed coldly, "Except that we also fell with them. At least now we don't have to pretend to love them anymore." It was then that I truly understood. This wasn't an accident. This was a deliberate murder, and the one who had planned it all was none other than the child I had given birth to, raised, and loved for 35 years. But to understand why Daniel would want to kill his own parents, I must take you back in time. Back to the days when I still believed our family was a happy one. Back to the tragic day when Michael, my eldest son, died in an accident 25 years ago. Because the truth is, Daniel had killed once before. And this time, he wanted to finish what he had left undone. To understand how that monster was born, we need to return to the very beginning, when my family was still a real family. If you want to continue hearing this story, don't forget to subscribe to Revenge Tales so you won't miss a single journey, where the truth is always brought to light. Do you believe an ordinary son could turn into someone willing to murder his own parents? But to understand how that monster came to be, I must take you back to the early days, when our family was still whole, when I still believed we were truly a family. For 40 years, Thomas and I built what we believed was a perfect home in Monterey, California. Every morning, I woke to the sound of the planer humming from Thomas's workshop. The same hands that had once held me on our wedding night were now tirelessly shaping furniture that I knew would outlast both of our lives. As for me, I taught 3rd grade at Monterey Bay Elementary School. In the afternoons, I came home and told Thomas about my students. He would put down his chisel, wipe the sweat from his brow, and listen intently as I spoke of little Jenny finally reading an entire passage, or shy Marcus at last daring to raise his hand to answer. That was our rhythm of life, meaningful work, genuine love, and the belief that we were living a good life. We had 2 sons. Michael, the eldest, had the mind of an engineer and the heart of a poet. In the workshop, he studied his father's techniques with scientific precision, then amazed us with improvements that made the work faster and neater. I remember once, when he was only 12, Michael held up a joint he had just made and asked his father, "Dad, what if we cut it at a different angle?" Thomas looked at his son, his eyes lighting up with a pride words could never capture. Daniel, 5 years younger than Michael, was entirely different. If Michael was an open book and a burst of laughter, Daniel lived in shadows and in an impenetrable silence. I used to tell myself perhaps it was just his personality. Some children bloom late, some need different soil to grow. But now, looking back, I wonder, were those silences already the seeds of darkness waiting to grow? Sunday afternoons in Thomas's workshop were sacred. Michael would stand on a small stool, holding a plank tightly while his father cut. Daniel would sit in the corner pretending to read, but his eyes were often fixed on his brother, a look so strange I could never quite name it. The workshop was always filled with the scent of cedar and endless possibilities, a place where Michael learned to create, and Daniel learned to envy. I remember Michael's 14th birthday. He crafted a little music box as a gift for me. When Thomas opened the lid, the melody of Moon River played, the very first song we had danced to on our wedding night. Thomas embraced me, eyes brimming with tears. I broke down crying with emotion, and Michael beamed with pride. But Daniel stood at the doorway, his eyes cold as ice. And now, when I think back, I realize that was the gaze of an enemy. Perhaps you're thinking, a few strange looks, a few childish moments, what's the harm in that? I once thought the same. But those little signs, when added up, when ignored, became cracks in the foundation of our family. And one day, those cracks would tear everything apart. Life in Monterey wasn't just about us, but also woven together with the community. Every Sunday, we went to St. Catherine's Church, where Father Rodriguez had blessed our marriage and baptized both our sons. There were the monthly gatherings where Linda's famous apple pie always had to compete with my chocolate chip cookies. Summer evenings when the whole neighborhood gathered at Lover's Point, watching the fog roll in from the Pacific, cloaking the town in a mystical white veil. Thomas and I became the couple others admired. 40 years of marriage, talented children, a house filled with handmade furniture and laughter. We believed we were proof that love could endure, that a family could be both strong and tender. But the truth is, we were far too naive. There were always moments that sent a chill down my spine, though at the time I quickly dismissed them. Like when Daniel was 8, and I caught him breaking the wings off a butterfly. When I asked him why, he only stared blankly at me and said, "I wanted to see if it could still fly with just one wing." Or the time Michael won a science competition and came home glowing with pride. We clapped and cheered. Daniel smiled too, but I noticed his hand clenched the spoon so tightly that his knuckles turned white. I told Thomas about it. He only laughed. "Barbara, kids will be kids." Every child has their odd moments. But now, I wish I had trusted my instincts more. When Michael turned 20, he had become my greatest pride, the kind of pride any mother would dream of. Tall, handsome, studying engineering at UC Berkeley with outstanding grades. But more important than all that, Michael still kept the kind heart he had carried since childhood. He often came home on weekends, bringing along thick textbooks on structural engineering. He would spend hours in the workshop with Thomas, passionately discussing how to improve machinery, about the bridges he dreamed of building one day. Thomas's eyes always lit up whenever he looked at his eldest son. "Michael will build bridges that connect entire cities," Thomas often told me. "Our son was born to do great things." Daniel, 15 at the time, grew more withdrawn. When Michael came home, he vanished into his room. When the family sat together at the dinner table, Daniel would quietly spoon his food, never joining the conversation. "What are you thinking about, Daniel?" I would often ask. "Nothing in particular, Mom," he replied, but his eyes always looked away. Michael was the opposite. He was warm, eager to help, waking up early to help me prepare breakfast, spending afternoons assisting his father in the workshop. On weekends, Michael even taught neighborhood kids how to make wooden toys. Daniel, on the other hand, had few friends, never helped with chores unless reminded, and even then, always with reluctance. "Maybe Daniel just needs more time," Thomas often reassured me. "Not every child is the same." But sometimes, even the smallest moment chilled me to the bone. Once I accidentally overheard Daniel on the phone. "I hate that perfect brother. Everyone keeps comparing us. I wish he'd just disappear." At the time, I thought it was nothing more than the usual sibling jealousy. But now, looking back, his voice was so cold it made me shiver. Perhaps you're wondering, why didn't Barbara do something? Why didn't she warn her husband? I had seen, I had heard those faint signals. But when you're a mother, sometimes you choose to believe in the good. And that choice made me close my eyes to the storm approaching. In early 1998, Michael began asking strange questions. Mom, do you remember exactly how much money we saved last Christmas? Dad, didn't you say you were setting aside money to buy new equipment for the workshop? At first, I thought Michael was preparing something special, perhaps a gift for our upcoming 40th wedding anniversary. But the truth was far more terrifying. With the logical mind of an engineer, Michael had noticed irregularities in the family accounts, small withdrawals at first, then larger amounts. He quietly investigated for months. I still remember one evening walking into his room and seeing him surrounded by papers, his computer, and bank statements. On one sheet were scribbled notes: March, minus $500, June, minus $800, September, minus $1,200. Michael, what are you doing? I asked. Startled, he hurriedly gathered the papers. Nothing, Mom. Just working on a finance assignment. But I had already caught a glimpse of 4 words scrawled at the bottom. Suspect Daniel. Then came the fateful night, October 13th, 1998. Fog rolled in from the Pacific, so thick it swallowed even the glow of the street lamps. I stood at the kitchen window, watching that gray curtain devour everything familiar, my heart heavy with unease. Michael didn't come home for dinner. This was unlike him. My son always called whenever he was late, because he knew I worried. By 11 o'clock, Thomas was restless. At midnight, we called the neighbors. At 1 a.m., Daniel walked into the kitchen, his jacket damp with mist, shoes muddy. "Where have you been?" I asked. "Library," he replied, not even looking up. "Lost track of time." But the Monterey Library closed at 9, and Daniel knew that. Thomas and the neighbors went searching for Michael. They combed through the town, the trails, every familiar corner. When dawn broke, they found Michael's body at the bottom of a ravine. The police ruled it an accident, that he might have stumbled in the dark. I believed it instantly because I couldn't bear to face any truth more horrifying. Michael's funeral was the darkest day of my life. I wore again the black dress I had worn at my mother's funeral. I cried until there were no tears left, while Daniel was eerily calm, far too calm for a boy who had just lost his brother. Now, thinking back, it was that very silence that chills me most. Thomas never left my side. He held me when my knees gave out, whispering words of comfort. But now I realize those words carried the bitter taste of a man hiding the truth. After Michael's death, Daniel changed completely. He became thoughtful, sweet, as if trying to make up for the pain. He helped me around the house, went with his father into the workshop, brought me flowers when he saw me sad. I believed it was his way of coping with loss, of filling the void Michael had left. But now I know. It was all just a perfect mask. And behind that mask, a monster was growing every single day. The years that followed drifted by like a hazy dream. The wound of losing Michael never healed, but we gradually learned how to live with it. Daniel married Olivia, a sweet girl from the neighboring town, and they seemed happy. Olivia called me Mom, helping with housework every time she visited. Daniel, having inherited Thomas's skillful hands, opened his own carpentry shop. Everything appeared to return to its course. When they had 2 beautiful children, I truly believed life was giving our family a second chance at happiness. But now, lying at the bottom of the cliff with broken ribs, the taste of blood filling my mouth, I finally understood. All that happiness had only been a carefully crafted lie. It all began 6 months ago when Thomas and I decided to update our will. We had saved our entire lives. Between the house, the land I inherited from my parents, and the bank savings, we had nearly 5 billion dong to leave for our children and grandchildren. It was Daniel who suggested we meet a lawyer. "Mom, Dad, you're already 60 now. It's important to make everything clear," he said with a smile that I now see only as sinister. Olivia sat beside him, stroking my hand with the very fingers that would one day push me to my death. "We love you so much, and we just want to make sure you're always protected," she said sweetly. I was foolish to believe it was genuine love. Albert, an old friend we had known for years, explained the options thoroughly. Either put the assets into a trust, divide the inheritance among the grandchildren, or make a traditional will. But Daniel insisted, "Mom, Dad, you should name Olivia and me as the sole heirs. We'll divide everything fairly among the kids." Then he added, in a voice that sounded caring yet carried calculation, "Besides, you'll need us as you grow older. Better that we have access to provide proper care for you." Something in his tone made my skin crawl, but Thomas seemed persuaded. He nodded, not raising much objection. I still remember Michael once promised he would take care of us in our old age, but Michael was gone. Daniel was the only child left, and I, weak-hearted, signed the paper. If only I had trusted my instincts then, things might have been different. But as parents, you always want to believe your children would never harm you. And that belief made me the easiest prey for my own son. From the day we signed the will, Daniel and Olivia's visits carried a different weight. They no longer came just to talk. Each visit brought a suggestion, a plan, fixing the house, buying insurance, making new investments. "Mom, you should really think about selling this big house and moving into a smaller apartment," Olivia said, her eyes scanning every piece of furniture as if appraising its worth. "We'll help you find a comfortable place in town." But how could I ever leave this house? Every wall held memories: the kitchen where I cooked thousands of meals, the workshop where Thomas created his masterpieces, the garden where our grandchildren once played. This house was my entire life. When I said that, I caught a flash of cold irritation in Daniel's eyes. "You're being too stubborn," he said, in a tone I had never heard from my son. "This house is too big for two old people. What if you fall down the stairs? If something happens, we won't be able to help in time." Olivia nodded eagerly, adding, "Besides, keeping up this house must be expensive. It would be much wiser to sell while the market is high." Thomas began to listen to them. My practical husband, for the first time, spoke of the logic in their suggestions, but I could not shake the feeling that something darker lay beneath their words of concern. One night, after a heated argument, I asked Thomas, "Don't you think it's strange? Why has Daniel suddenly become so interested in our money?" "Barbara, he's only looking out for us," he answered while brushing his teeth. "Maybe we should consider it." We're not young anymore, but I had seen, just for a moment, a shadow flicker in his eyes, a doubt he dared not speak aloud. Things escalated when Daniel suggested we grant him financial power of attorney. "It's just precaution," he said, while Olivia calmly brewed tea in my kitchen as if it were her own home. "If something happens to either of you, we can manage the assets without all the complicated legal procedures." He said it so naturally it almost convinced me, but the way he emphasized it so strongly unsettled me. That night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to Thomas's steady breathing beside me, and I knew something was very wrong. The next day I called Evelyn. She had always been the wiser one, always skeptical of things I naively overlooked. I told her everything. Evelyn was silent for a long time. Then she said, "Barbara, doesn't it strike you as odd? Daniel has his own shop, he's not short on money, so why is he so insistent on controlling your assets?" Her words sliced through the fog in my mind like a knife. She was right. Daniel had never borrowed money, had never shown signs of need, so why did he want everything from us? That was the moment I realized. My family had stepped into truly dangerous territory. That afternoon, when Daniel came again for another conversation about our future, I decided to confront him directly. "Son," I said, as the family sat in the living room, "why is it so important for you to control your parents' finances?" We're still clear-minded, not helpless enough to need someone else managing things for us. Daniel's reaction sent a chill down my spine immediately. His face hardened, and in that moment I caught a familiar yet terrifying look, cold, calculating, Dangerous. "Mom, this isn't control," he replied, his voice taut. "This is love. This is family responsibility." But the way Daniel emphasized the word responsibility sounded more like a threat than concern. Olivia, silent until then, cut in. Her voice was sweet but firm. "Barbara, we only want what's best for you. It breaks our hearts to see you worry about things we could handle for you." That night, after they left, Thomas and I had our first serious argument in decades of marriage. He said I was being paranoid, creating problems where there were none, but I couldn't shake the feeling in my gut. "Thomas," I said, as we washed the dishes, "do you remember what Daniel was like before Michael died? He was different, more distant, darker. Something about him scared me." Thomas stopped washing the plate, staring at me. In his eyes, I saw something new, a realization. "Barbara," he said softly, his voice low like a whisper, "there are things about Michael's death that I've never told you." My heart pounded wildly in my chest. I felt I was about to hear something that would change everything. If life has a moment that draws a line between before and after, this was that moment. I wanted to know, yet feared the truth Thomas was about to reveal. And perhaps that's why I can never forget a single word of his confession that night. "The night Michael died," Thomas began, his voice choking, "Daniel wasn't in the study like he told us. I saw him leave the house around 8 p.m. I followed him because his behavior those days was alarming. Angry, resentful. He dropped heavily into a kitchen chair, burying his face in his hands as if trying to erase the memory that had haunted him for 25 years. I saw them arguing by the ravine. Barbara, I heard them shouting terrible things at each other. I trembled. What were they arguing about? Thomas looked up, tears streaming down his face, tears he hadn't even shed at Michael's funeral. About the inheritance. Daniel was angry that Michael, as the eldest, would receive most of the assets according to tradition. But it wasn't just that. It was also about the money Michael had discovered. "What money?" I asked, feeling the ground crumble beneath my feet. 3 days before he died, Thomas said, Michael came to see me in the workshop. He had discovered Daniel was stealing money from the family account. At first it was small amounts, but then larger. Michael had proof. He had been investigating for months. I shook my head in disbelief. My youngest son, the one I thought had been so attentive after his brother's death, had been betraying us even before that. Why didn't you tell me?" I nearly screamed, feeling betrayed twice over. Thomas looked down at his trembling hands. "Because when I reached the ravine that night, it was too late. Michael was lying motionless at the bottom of the cliff. Daniel was trembling, crying, his mouth repeating, 'It was an accident.' I acted in self-defense. Michael lost his balance. He begged me to help him, Barbara, and I believed him." "You believed him?" I whispered, tears running down my face. Thomas nodded heavily. "I thought Michael was gone. There was no saving him. If we called the police, we would lose Daniel too. I told myself it really was an accident, that Daniel would change. I believed it because I needed to believe our son wasn't a murderer." My voice cracked. "And the stolen money?" "He promised he'd pay it back, that he'd taken it to invest in a failed shop. He swore he wouldn't do it again. And I believed him." I staggered to my feet, clinging to the wall to keep from falling. Everything I had believed about my family, about Daniel, about this marriage, collapsed right there in our familiar kitchen. "Did he ever pay it back?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Never," Thomas admitted. "He kept taking money. I pretended not to see because admitting it meant admitting I had covered up a murder. I became an accomplice, Barbara. Every time I stayed silent, I sank deeper. A horrifying truth began to form inside me. That's why he wants to control the finances now. Not out of love, but because he wants to finish what he started 25 years ago. Thomas nodded, his eyes weary. And there's one more thing, Barbara. Something I've only discovered in recent weeks. What else? I whispered, feeling my heart couldn't take another truth. Thomas opened a drawer and pulled out a stack of papers. I investigated Daniel's finances. The carpentry shop isn't successful. In fact, it's on the verge of bankruptcy. He owes more than $2 million to banks and suppliers. I took the papers, my hands shaking. The glaring red numbers danced before my eyes. Daniel wasn't the successful man he had pretended to be. He was a desperate failure, living on lies and stolen money. And now I understood. In Daniel's eyes, we weren't just a burden, we were his last lifeline. "Does Olivia know all of this?" I asked, the image of her sweet smile and seemingly genuine hugs flashing in my mind. "I'm certain she does," Thomas replied, his voice heavy. "I've noticed the way she steers the conversation whenever money comes up. The way she asks very specific questions about savings, the value of the house, or life insurance. Barbara, those aren't innocent questions. Those are the questions of someone calculating how much our deaths are worth." His words sent an icy shiver down my spine. "Our deaths," I repeated, whispering in sheer terror. That was the first moment I dared to admit. Daniel might not only want to steal or deceive us. If he had once killed Michael for money, what could possibly stop him from killing his own parents? "Thomas," I gripped my husband's hand tightly, "we have to go to the police. We have to tell the truth about Michael and about what's happening now." But Thomas shook his head, his eyes filled with a despair that crushed my heart. "With what evidence, Barbara?" "I've covered it up for 25 years. If I confess, I'll go to prison too. Who will believe a 65-year-old man suddenly admitting he was an accomplice?" He was right. My voice broke as I asked, "So what? We just sit here and wait for him to kill us like he killed Michael?" Thomas squeezed my hand, trying to appear strong. "We'll be careful. We'll find a way to protect ourselves, and if we're lucky, we'll get evidence." He didn't finish. The phone rang. It was Daniel. "Hi, Mom," he said, his voice dripping with sweetness that now felt like a blade scraping against my teeth. "Olivia and I thought it would be wonderful to celebrate your 40th wedding anniversary with something special. This weekend, let's go to Big Sur together. A family hike, take some photos, enjoy a perfect day." My blood froze. I looked at Thomas and saw the same horror mirrored in his eyes. "That sounds very sweet, son." I forced my voice to remain calm. "But let us think about it, and we'll call you tomorrow." When I hung up, we sat in silence, both of us knowing the invitation wasn't for an outing. It was a one-way ticket to our execution. "Big Sur," I whispered. "He wants to take us to Big Sur to kill us and stage it as an accident." Thomas nodded, his voice dry as dust. "Exactly like what he did to Michael at the ravine. If you've ever felt death approaching, then you'll understand what we felt in that moment. Every touch, every smile from our son and daughter-in-law had become daggers wrapped in velvet, and we knew there was no turning back. That night, we didn't sleep a single minute. Holding each other in bed, we whispered survival plans, knowing the enemy this time wasn't a stranger. It was our own flesh and blood. The following days were a nightmare. Every time Daniel and Olivia visited, we had to smile, to nod along when they spoke of the trip. But inside, I felt only horror. I was staring into the eyes of the people who had killed my eldest son and who now wanted to finish off his parents. On Wednesday afternoon, Olivia arrived with a large bag and a radiant smile that I now saw only as the grin of the devil. "Dear Barbara," she hugged me with those icy hands, "I bought everything for the adventure. Cookies, water, fruit, all so we'll have a perfect day." Then she pulled out a brand new digital camera. I want to capture every moment. Photos we'll treasure forever. I choked back my breath. The photo she intended to take was of our bodies at the bottom of the cliff. Moments later, Daniel walked in, a brand new hiking backpack strapped to his shoulders, the tag still dangling. "Dad," he said, his voice brimming with false excitement. "I've prepared all the safety equipment. Ropes, flashlights, a first aid kit. You don't need to worry about a thing." Every word he spoke sounded like a cruel joke. Safety equipment? They were nothing but props in his murder plot. That evening, after they left, Thomas and I sat in the living room, our hands trembling not from cold, but from the horrifying truth we had just hidden for hours. "We can't go," I said, tears streaming down my face. "We have to find an excuse." Thomas shook his head, his voice breaking. "If we don't go, they'll find another way. Maybe a house fire, maybe a staged robbery. At least in Big Sur, we know what they're planning." I froze. The reasoning was brutal, but terrifyingly logical. "So what do you intend to do?" I asked. "We'll go," Thomas whispered, "but we'll prepare. I'll hide a phone, let it record everything. If we survive, we'll have proof. If we don't," his voice faltered, "at least someone will know the truth." Friday night, dinner went untouched. We knew it could be our last meal in that house, the kitchen once full of laughter and family memories. "I wrote a letter," Thomas said, producing a sealed envelope. "For Evelyn." Inside, I explained everything, about Michael, about Daniel, and what we believe is about to happen. I hid it with the important documents. If we don't come back, at least she'll know. That night we held each other, whispering what might be our last words of love. "If something happens," Thomas said, his lips trembling, "remember that these 40 years with you have been the best of my life. Despite the secrets, despite the mistakes, I've loved you more than life itself." I cried silently, memorizing every breath, every warmth, every familiar scent of him. Tomorrow, we might die, but at least we would face it together, with the truth finally laid bare. That Saturday, dawn broke with a clear blue sky, a sky that seemed to mock our situation. Daniel arrived early, whistling a cheerful tune that made my skin crawl. "Good morning, little songbirds," he called from the door. "Ready for the adventure?" Olivia appeared right after, radiant as a bride on her wedding day. Except this wasn't a wedding. It was an appointment with death. During breakfast, which Thomas and I could hardly swallow, Daniel spread out a map on the table, explaining the trail in meticulous detail. "This is a beautiful route," he said, his eyes gleaming with a twisted excitement. "When we reach the lookout point, you'll see the whole valley. They say the view there is spectacular." Of course it was spectacular, because it would be the last view we ever saw. "There are a few slopes," Olivia added, her voice light, like a tour guide, "but nothing experienced hikers like you two can't handle." The words sounded like a cruel joke. We were 60-year-olds who had only ever walked in the park. As they packed the car, I noticed Daniel carefully checking his backpack, ropes, a small shovel, and something that looked like a flare gun. "What's that for?" I asked. "For safety," he answered quickly. "If we get lost, we can send a rescue signal." I knew better. That rescue signal would only be fired after our bodies lay at the bottom of the cliff, so someone would find us and conclude it was only an accident. Every detail had been planned perfectly. The 2-hour drive to Big Sur felt like an eternity. Olivia played cheerful music, singing along as if this were a family picnic. Daniel drove with exaggerated care, stopping at every sign, never speeding. He didn't want any accident to ruin his murder plan. The whole way, Thomas silently held my hand. Then, discreetly, he switched on the recording app on his phone. From that moment, everything would be captured. If we survived, there would be proof. If we didn't, at least the truth wouldn't die with us. If you've ever sat in a car knowing the destination is your own execution site, you'll understand how I felt then. Every curve in the road, every song Olivia sang, every turn of the tires sounded like a ticking clock counting down to death. When the car stopped at the trailhead, my heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst. The scenery was breathtaking, lush forest, the sound of a stream trickling nearby. But to me, it was an execution ground. Daniel and Olivia took their backpacks, laughing as though this were the happiest day of their lives. "Ready for the adventure?" Daniel asked. And for the first time in 25 years, I saw in his eyes the same look he had the night he killed Michael. The trail began gently, winding past ancient trees and mossy rocks. Olivia walked ahead, snapping photos, praising the beauty of the landscape. Her performance was flawless, the picture of a cheerful, loving daughter-in-law. Daniel stayed behind us, pretending to be caring. "Are you two okay? Need a break?" But I could feel his eyes fixed on our backs, like a blade pressed against our skin. After an hour, the path grew steeper. My legs felt like lead. Thomas was breathing heavily. Clearly, they had chosen this route to wear us down, to make it easier to strike. "We're almost there," Olivia cheered, but I knew it was a lie. According to the map, there was still at least an hour left. They had no intention of taking us to the real lookout. The execution site had to be closer. I forced myself to memorize every detail: the trees, the cliffs, the bends, just in case I lived to tell the police. Thomas was doing the same. Each time our eyes met, I saw the same terror, but also determination. "Oh, look there!" Olivia suddenly pointed at a rocky outcrop. "From there, the view will be incredible. Why don't we climb up and take some special photos?" My blood turned to ice. That was the spot. A sheer cliff, 30 meters down, jagged rocks waiting below. No witnesses, no chance of survival. "I'm not sure that's safe," I said, forcing my voice to stay calm. "That path looks dangerous for people our age." But Daniel was already moving toward the side trail, backpack strapped on. "Come on, Mom," he said, using the same coaxing tone he once used to get me to buy him toys. "It'll just take a few minutes." Olivia's right. The view will be spectacular. I shuddered. To them, it wasn't just spectacular. It was the staged evidence for our accident. Thomas squeezed my hand, reminding me the phone was still recording. We had to keep going, had to gather enough evidence. Refusing now would only give them another chance to kill us later. The climb was exhausting. Rocks slid beneath our feet, and more than once I nearly fell. But what chilled me most was how perfect this place was for murder. One little shove, and no one would survive. "Almost there?" Olivia called, already at the top with suspicious agility. Daniel followed, then turned back to help us. His hand gripped mine, but it felt no different than the talons of a vulture. The summit opened to a sweeping view. The valley stretched out, mountains rising, a river snaking through the forest. In another life, this would have been the perfect place for a family memory. But to me, it was a stage for tragedy. "Come here for a photo," Olivia called, standing near the edge. "I want the valley in the background." Thomas and I stepped forward, one step at a time, knowing each step carried us closer to death. Daniel moved behind us, adjusting positions as though calculating the perfect angle for a push. "Perfect!" Olivia exclaimed, raising the camera. "Hold each other and smile." Thomas wrapped his arms around me, perhaps for the last time. The flash went off, like alarm bells ringing. "Let's take another," Daniel said, stepping closer. "But this time, step back a little. So the view looks better." One step back meant standing right on the edge. Thomas looked at me, and I knew. The moment of fate had come. This was the instant we would find out, whether we lived or died. We stepped back as if controlled, feeling the solid ground beneath our feet vanish, leaving only the icy void of the abyss behind us. Olivia raised the camera once more, and this time I saw clearly what was in her eyes. The mask had fallen. "Smile," she said, her voice stripped of sweetness. "This will be your last photo." At that very moment, Daniel lunged toward us, arms outstretched, ready to end it all. The plan was so simple: shove us off the cliff, snap a few photos to stage it as an accident, then climb down later to discover the shattered bodies of his parents. But Thomas had prepared for this moment. In that instant of life or death, he suddenly grabbed Daniel's wrist and yanked him forward. "If we have to die, then you're coming with us," he roared, fury erupting in him like I had never seen in 40 years of marriage. In a split second, all four of us teetered on the cliff's edge, locked in a grotesque dance between life and death. Olivia screamed, trying to pull Daniel back, but the weight of all of us was too much to control. I felt the ground shift beneath me, then vanish. Together we plunged, trapped in a deadly embrace, our screams ripping through the air as the wind shrieked past and the jagged rocks below rushed upward to meet us. Those seconds stretched into an eternity. Amid the chaos, I thought only of Michael, the son Daniel had killed 25 years ago. Had he felt this same terror, pushed into the ravine by his own brother? The impact was deafening, bones cracking like brittle glass, my body slamming against the sharp rocks. Pain exploded through me, so intense I nearly lost consciousness. Blood gushed from my mouth, the metallic taste overwhelming. In that dark moment, I was certain Daniel had won. This time, there would be no witnesses to tell the truth. Then I heard Thomas's voice, weak but commanding, like his final order. "Barbara, don't move. Pretend you're dead." And I understood. I was still alive. There are moments when life and death are separated by a single breath. Lying there, motionless, I realized I had no choice but to play the part of a corpse. One wrong move, one betrayed breath, and it would all be over. You may wonder, did I have the strength to keep up such a dangerous act? Pain shredded every nerve, but I forced myself to stay still, even controlling my breathing so no one would notice. Nearby, I heard groans. Daniel and Olivia had survived too, but their sounds told me their injuries were worse. "Olivia," Daniel's voice trembled. "Are you okay?" "My leg. It's broken," she moaned. "It hurts so much." "And what about the old folks?" Olivia's voice cut sharp, bitter. My heart clenched. We had never been family in their eyes. We were only obstacles in the path to their fortune. After a few silent minutes, Daniel declared, "They're dead." Eyes open, but no breath left. That lie, paradoxically, lit a spark of hope inside me. If they believed we were dead, we might still have a chance. "Perfect," Olivia whispered, her voice dripping with delight. "Everything went exactly to plan." "Yeah," Daniel replied, "except we fell too. But at least now we don't have to pretend to love them anymore." Every word was a blade, cutting deeper, but it was also living proof of the crimes they had tried so hard to bury. I knew somehow we had to survive and drag this truth into the light. At that very moment, we heard voices echoing from afar. Daniel and Olivia had found help. Soon the rescue team would arrive, and our murderous children would step onto the stage for the performance of their lives, pretending to be traumatized survivors of a family tragedy. The sounds drew closer, mixed with the chopping roar of helicopter blades above. The rescue team was here, and with them came the most crucial moment of our lives. Thomas and I had only minutes to decide. Keep playing dead, waiting for the perfect chance to expose the truth, or risk being lifted up alongside our would-be killers. "Barbara," Thomas whispered urgently. The phone recorded everything that happened up there. We have Olivia confessing the plan. We have Daniel admitting we're obstacles. We have it all. But if they find out we're alive now, they could destroy the evidence before we can hand it to the authorities. He was right. If Daniel and Olivia realized we had survived and overheard their confessions, they would silence us forever. And this time, it wouldn't be staged as an accident. It would be something far more brutal and final. We had to wait for the right moment. "They're down here," Daniel shouted from above. "My parents! Please hurry!" His performance was flawless, his voice cracking with pain and desperation. Had I not known the truth, I might have believed he was a son who had just lost both parents. "Stay calm," a firm, deep voice answered. It must have been the rescue leader. "We're coming down to assess the situation." "Can they move at all?" I heard ropes, hooks, and gear clattering as they prepared to descend. Meanwhile, Olivia perfected her role as the grieving daughter-in-law. "I can't believe it! We were just happily taking photos. Everything happened so fast. A loose rock, and then they fell." Every word was a knife. I knew she would repeat the exact story to the police, to the media, to anyone who would listen to her version. The rescuers began lowering themselves. I heard their boots scraping rock, the jangle of metal hooks. Thomas squeezed my hand discreetly, reminding me we had to keep acting no matter what. "Here they are," one rescuer shouted when he spotted us. "2 victims at the bottom of the ravine." He moved closer to check. I kept my eyes tightly shut, my breathing shallow. I felt his hand press against my neck, then his ear near my lips to listen for breath. "The man has a pulse, but it's weak," he reported. "The woman, I'm not sure. We need medical support down here, immediately." My heart pounded like a war drum. The plan was working. They would think Thomas was barely hanging on, and that I was nearly gone, just enough not to be seen as a threat. The minutes dragged on like hours. The paramedics worked tirelessly, oxygen masks, wound checks, strapping me to a stretcher. Through it all, I had to fight every instinct screaming at me. "Open your eyes. Call for help. Stop pretending." "The man is stabilized, but critical," I heard someone radio. "The woman is very severe. Pulse almost undetectable. We need immediate transport." Perfect. In the hospital, we would finally have the chance to speak to authorities without Daniel and Olivia interfering. In the lift basket, I heard Olivia's fake sobs and the rescuers' words of comfort to them. "You two are so brave to survive this. It's a miracle you're both relatively okay. If only they knew the real miracle was Thomas and I were still alive to tell the truth." There are moments when fate teeters on a knife's edge. One slip of the tongue, one misplaced glance, one heartbeat too strong, and everything could collapse. And what happened next, one seemingly small detail, turned my entire life around. In the medevac helicopter, I sensed Thomas on the stretcher beside me. The paramedics worked frantically to keep him stable. From their brief exchanges, I understood his condition was worse than mine, so bad I feared he might die before the truth ever surfaced. At the hospital, chaos exploded. Doctors and nurses rushing everywhere, commands shouted in rapid succession. I was wheeled straight into the emergency room. I had to keep pretending to be unconscious, yet also needed to find someone trustworthy to alert. "Doctor, her vitals are strange," a nurse said. "Her pulse is stronger than expected for her condition." I froze. Had I been discovered? Was my body betraying me? The doctor muttered. "That can happen in major trauma. The body finds strange ways to cling to life. Keep monitoring closely. The next few hours are critical hours later. Daniel and Olivia were allowed to visit." I heard their footsteps approaching my bed. This was the most dangerous moment. I had to convince my murderous son I was dying. I felt Daniel's hand touch mine. I fought the urge to recoil. "Mom," he whispered, his voice dripping with honey, "if you can hear me, I want you to know I love you." "I'm so sorry for what happened," poisoned honey. Love on the surface, death at its core. Olivia leaned in from the other side. "Dear Barbara, you're like a real mother to me. We'll never forget you, liar." The only reason they'd never forget me was because they'd have to live with the memory of killing me. Then Daniel bent closer, his breath at my ear, whispering words that froze my blood. "I hope you've learned your lesson. Stop asking too many questions about our finances. Some truths are better buried. Like Michael." At that instant, I knew our plan had worked. He had just confessed. Even though I hadn't recorded it, a nurse in the room had heard everything. That whisper resounded like a direct admission of guilt. He had mentioned Michael, spoken of truths better buried, and most damning, linked our questions about money to the accident. The nurse, a young woman, her badge reading INS, stood frozen beside the monitor. Through my half-closed eyes, I saw her wide stare, horrified but clear. She had heard what she should not have, and understood exactly what it meant. "What did you just say about Michael?" Olivia whispered, shocked that her husband had slipped. Daniel faltered, realizing he'd gone too far. "No, nothing. I mean, Mom always wondered about that night, but now it doesn't matter anymore." But it did matter, and Olivia was sharp enough to know her husband had just made a grave mistake. "Daniel," she said, her voice tight as a wire, "let's go." The doctors need space to work. The air between them was heavy, like an alliance suddenly cracked. After they left, Nurse Inns stepped closer. "Ma'am," she whispered, so softly I barely heard. "I know you can hear me. What I just heard is not normal. If you're in danger, please find a way to tell me." Slowly I twitched my index finger. Barely a movement, but Inns caught it instantly. "Oh my God," she breathed. "She's pretending to be unconscious." I twitched my finger again, twice. "Okay," she whispered, leaning closer. "I'll pretend to check the monitors. If those two are the ones who did this, twitch 3 times. Without hesitation, I twitched 3 times. Inns gasped quietly. "They did this to you." I twitched 3 more times. She backed away, pretending to check my IV line, her mind clearly racing. Then she returned, murmuring, "I'll report this to the attending doctor. But you must keep pretending until we can protect you. Do you understand?" I twitched once. At last, someone believed me and was ready to act. The next few minutes were a whirlwind of urgent activity I could barely keep up with. Inns left the room, while I lay there alone, praying she believed my story and would do the right thing. At last, I heard footsteps returning. Inns came back with an older man, surely the head doctor, and, to my surprise, 2 police officers. "Ma'am," the doctor said quietly but firmly, "Nurse Inns has briefed me on your situation. If you can hear me, know that you are safe. These officers are here to protect you." A wave of relief surged through me so strong I nearly broke character. "Can you open your eyes?" one of the officers asked. Slowly, ever so slowly, I opened them. The hospital lights blinded me at first. Then gradually, I saw the tense faces gathered around me. "Thank God," Inns whispered. "I thought I was losing my mind." "Ma'am," the stern-looking middle-aged officer spoke, "I'm Detective Johnson. We understand you may be in danger. Can you tell us what really happened on that mountain?" My voice was hoarse after hours of pretending. My son and daughter-in-law pushed us." The hours that followed were a storm of testimony, recordings, and revelations. I told Detective Johnson everything: Michael's death, Daniel's theft of money, the pressure to change the will, and finally the plan to kill us on the mountain. But most crucial of all was the recording on Thomas's phone. "Your husband recorded evidence?" the detective asked, eyes lighting up. "Yes," I answered. "Everything is on his phone. The confessions, the plan, all of it." The detective immediately went to the room where Thomas was being treated. Thomas regained consciousness an hour after me. When told what was happening, he handed over the phone without hesitation. "This is everything," he said, his voice weak but steady. 25 years of lies, and the truth about what happened today. While the police technicians analyzed the files, Daniel and Olivia still sat in the waiting area, playing their roles as devastated relatives before hospital staff and visitors. They had no idea that upstairs we were tearing down the curtain of lies they had built for decades. "Everything is very clear," the detective reported an hour later. "We have direct confessions regarding Michael's death, admissions of theft, and solid evidence of premeditated attempted murder against both of you. That's more than enough for an arrest." "You'll arrest them here, won't you?" I asked nervously. "If they realize we're alive and talking—" "We've already arranged it," he nodded. "As soon as the warrant is signed, they'll be handcuffed. In the meantime, you're under protection." "One more thing," the detective said, opening a file. "After hearing your story, we dug into your son's finances. He's not just bankrupt as you suspected. He owes money to some very dangerous lenders, people who don't accept excuses." My blood ran cold. "You mean we weren't just inconvenient to him?" "That's right," he replied. "You were his only lifeline. With the inheritance, he could pay off his debts and start over. Without you, he might not have lasted a few weeks." The revelation added another layer of betrayal. To him, we weren't just obstacles. We were his life raft. Our deaths weren't just convenient. They were essential for his survival. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive with the bang of a gavel, but through a chain of small details pieced together into an undeniable picture. And soon, every piece, the warrant, the shouting, the finger-pointing, would fall into place as if fate itself had arranged them. "It's time," the detective said, as an officer entered with paperwork. "The warrant's signed. We'll move now." Through the hospital window, I saw police discreetly taking positions around the parking lot. The moment I had waited for 25 years had finally arrived. "Daniel Black and Olivia Black," the commanding officer's voice thundered. "You are under arrest for the murder of Michael Black and the attempted murder of Barbara and Thomas Black." A thick silence. Then Olivia's hysterical scream, "What are you talking about?" "We're the victims. My in-laws died in an accident." "Ma'am," the officer replied calmly, "they are alive and have provided full evidence of your crimes." A stunned pause, then Daniel's desperate howl. "That's impossible!" "We saw them dead. They were dead." That inadvertent confession was caught in full by the police recorder, another piece locking the case shut. Over the radio, I heard Olivia start to shift blame. It was all his idea. I didn't want to do anything. "He forced me," Daniel, panicking, screamed. "You're the one who suggested the cliff. You planned it all." Within minutes, the alliance they had built for years cracked and shattered, each scrambling to save themselves. An hour later, Detective Johnson returned to my room, his face a mixture of relief and sorrow. "They've been arrested and are in custody," he said. "Each is trying to blame the other, which only strengthens the case." He placed a small digital recorder on the table. "We found this in your son's backpack. It seems he had been recording conversations with you over the past few weeks, likely to gauge how much you suspected." I shivered. "What does that mean?" "It means he knew you were getting close to the truth. The mountain trip wasn't spontaneous. It was a direct response to your suspicions." He flipped a page in the file. In one recording, you can clearly hear Olivia say, "We need to act quickly before they go to the police." The cold calculation behind it took my breath away. They hadn't just plotted murder. They had been watching us, measuring our words. We were mice in a maze, and they were the ones outside studying. "And one more thing," the detective continued. "In our financial investigation, we discovered your son not only stole money, he forged your signature on documents to try to access your accounts. Had you died on that mountain, he would have had immediate access to everything." Each revelation was a blade. My son hadn't only tried to kill me, he had stolen, forged, trampled every principle I'd ever taught him about trust and family. "How much in total did he take?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "About $50,000 over the last 5 years, the detective said. "Small withdrawals, designed to go unnoticed, adding up to a large sum." That was our life savings, every penny of sweat and labor. Money meant to sustain us, now funding a false life, while its owner plotted to kill the very parents who gave it to him. The days that followed in the hospital were a whirlwind. Police interviews, visits from lawyers, and calls from reporters as the story spread. Local papers called it the most brutal family betrayal of the decade. Journalists from everywhere wanted to hear our version. Evelyn rushed from the next town, hugging me through tears as if we'd been parted for decades. "Barbara," she kept repeating, "I always felt something was off with Daniel after Michael's death, but I never imagined he could do this." Her words comforted me. My instincts as a mother hadn't been entirely blind. "And the children?" I asked, thinking of Daniel and Olivia's 2 little ones, now temporarily in social services care. "I saw them yesterday," Evelyn said sadly. "They're so confused, asking why their parents haven't come back. They're far too young to understand what's happened. The thought of raising the children of the very people who tried to murder me was overwhelming. But they were innocent. They deserved to grow up in a home where love was real, not an act." The trial began 6 months later. On the day I had to testify, I looked directly into Daniel's eyes for the first time since he was arrested. I saw no remorse, no pain. I no longer recognized the son I had raised. In front of me was only a stranger, cold and calculating, who had worn the mask of son for decades. When I finished my testimony, after recounting every horrifying detail of the experience, I turned fully toward him and spoke from the witness stand. "Daniel, I don't know who you are anymore, but you are no longer my son. My son died the night you killed Michael. What has lived in his place for 25 years is a monster, one I unknowingly helped to raise." The jury deliberated for 3 days before finding Daniel guilty of first-degree murder for Michael's death and guilty of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder for what he did to us. Olivia received the same charges as an accomplice. Both were sentenced to life in prison without parole. As the judge read the sentence, I felt a deep relief I hadn't thought possible. Not out of vengeance. I had no energy left for hatred, but because at last, after 25 years, Michael had been vindicated. Justice doesn't always erase scars, but it restores the true name of the dead. From that moment, our lives were no longer a flight from pain, but a journey of learning to go on and teaching the children that truth can heal. What follows is how we began again. A year later, Thomas and I began the process of officially adopting our 2 grandchildren. They are lovely, innocent children who deserve the chance to grow up in genuine love, not the manipulative, toxic affection their parents sowed. Every night as I tuck them into bed, I tell them about Uncle Richard, the brother they will never meet. I tell them about kindness, honesty, and his dream of becoming an engineer to build bridges that connect cities. "Uncle Richard would have loved you so much," I often say. And every day we live with kindness, we honor his memory. Thomas returned to the workshop, but with a new purpose. He teaches the children, our grandchildren and the neighborhood kids, how to work with wood, the craft he once shared with Michael and tried to share with Daniel. "Wood doesn't lie," he often tells them. "It reveals its nature. If you work with patience and respect, it becomes something beautiful." I understand. This is how he faces his guilt, by passing the best of the past to a new generation. The Monterey community embraced us with warmth I never expected. Neighbors of decades helped us in every way. St. Catherine's Parish held a fundraiser for medical costs. The elementary school where I once taught named a small library after Michael. "Family is not only blood," Father Rodriguez said at the library dedication. "Family is the people who choose to love and lift one another, even in the darkest hours." People often ask, "Have I forgiven Daniel?" It's a question I still wrestle with. I cannot forgive what he did, killing Michael, trying to kill us, 25 years of lies and manipulation. Those acts are unforgivable. But I have learned to forgive myself, for missing the signs, for believing when I should have questioned, for loving a child who ultimately became something twisted. And more importantly, I learned that true love, the love I have for Michael, for Thomas, and now for our grandchildren, is worth the risk of being hurt. True love, unlike the counterfeit version Daniel once displayed, has the power to heal and rebuild. In Michael's drawer, we found letters he never sent, written to us about his future plans, about caring for us in our old age, about the home he hoped to build someday. One passage made me break down. Dear Mom and Dad, I hope one day to build a home for my family right near yours, so the children can grow up in their grandparents' arms. I want them to understand what family means, not just those who share blood, but those who choose to love and protect one another. Those lines now mean more than ever. Every day I wake in a house where too much has happened, where I raised two sons, one became a hero, the other a monster, where love and betrayal lived side by side for years. But it is also the house where our grandchildren's laughter now fills the silence Daniel left behind. I wake beside the man who has loved me for 40 years, a man who made a terrible mistake but ultimately chose truth over comfort. And every day I remember Michael, not as Daniel's victim, but as a hero brave enough to stand on the right side, even when that meant facing his own brother. If my story teaches anything, it's this. Truth, no matter how painful, is better than lies. True love never asks you to keep silent in the face of evil. And a real family is not defined solely by blood, but by daily choice. The choice to love, protect, and stay loyal to one another. I lost one child to greed and envy. I realized the other had never truly been my child at all. But I was also given the chance to raise two new little ones, the chance to create the kind of family love Michael once wrote about. And with every day we live kindly, we prove that love and truth, rare and precious, are always stronger than the dark. That is what Michael would want, and that is the legacy we will leave these children. Not fear and suspicion, but the belief that in the end, love and truth always prevail. If you believe truth and love have the power to conquer darkness, hit subscribe to Revenge Tales so you won't miss more dramatic, emotionally rich stories like this. What do you think? Could you forgive a betrayal from your own family, or would that wound never heal?